everybody. So in this video we are going to go over the PowerPoint on Chapter 10, writing about setting and atmosphere. Right? So when we talk about stories, one of the things that we most definitely need to pay attention to is the setting. So we're going to talk about what setting is, what atmosphere is, and what mood is. Right? So when we talk about the setting, obviously the first thing we're referring to is the location in which the story takes place. But it also refers to the time in which the story takes place. Because knowing the time period that the story is unfolding in definitely helps our understanding of what the characters are doing, why, what's happening around them, the context of the story itself, especially if it's something that seems very different to us, things that we're not familiar with. Knowing the time period that the story takes place in is important. That's not the same thing as the time period that the story was written in. That is an element that you can talk about, but that's not really what we're talking about with setting. That's more of an outside historical influence in terms of when the story was actually written, and that's different. When we're talking about time in terms of setting, it's when the story itself takes place. Because I could write a story today that takes place 100 years ago. So in terms of setting, the setting for the story is not today. The setting of the story is 100 years ago. So you want to pay attention to the time period that the story takes place in. And you want to ask yourself, does the setting, both the location and or the time period, does the setting affect the story and our understanding of it in a significant way? Would the story still convey the same meaning? Would it have the same influence, the same effect, if the setting was different? If you can read a story and you think to yourself, it doesn't matter where this is taking place or when it's taking place, the story is still the same, the impact is still the same, the theme is still the same, then the setting was probably not of great significance. But if the setting makes you think, like if it's an integral part, if it's very much tied to what happens in the story, what the characters experience, and what we're supposed to get from it, then the setting is worth paying attention to, right? Now, sometimes a setting can produce an emotional effect that then contributes to the meaning of the story. This is what we call atmosphere. So, for instance, if you have a story and the narrator is a madman, crazy person, and the setting of the story is in a dark, bone-filled catacomb, it will create a feeling of horror and foreboding. It's a very creepy, eerie atmosphere, right? So, if the atmosphere is easily felt, then chances are that it was a purposeful creation by the author, and that we should consider it within the context of the story's theme. So the setting is the physical and time location of the story, which by itself can be meaningful. But if it's taken an extra step further, that setting can create a specific atmosphere that carries an emotional quality to it. So it could be, fear and, horror is the easy one to use as an example. But the setting can also create an atmosphere of sadness and longing. it could create a feeling of joy and excitement. You know, if you have for instance, a story that takes place like at a carnival, you know, that's a pretty happy place. If you have, you know, a story that's taking place in the middle of a storm, that will create a very specific atmosphere. So thinking about the setting, is the location and the time period significant? On top of that, does the location create any type of atmosphere that makes us feel a certain way as we read the story? Okay? So, the setting for the story of an hour. So we have the location first, where the story is taking place. Most of it takes place in Mrs. Mallard's bedroom. And if you think about her being in that room, she's confined within those four walls in that small space, much as she is confined in her marriage as well. The open window that she looks out while she's in her room, as we already know, it represents the freedom that she's yearned for. And she now thinks that she hasn't, right? While she's confined in that room, that open window is a very important element of the setting as well. So we've got the confined space of the room and the open window and what it represents. Now, for this particular story, thinking about the time period in which it takes place is also significant. It takes place in the late 1800s. So if you consider the state of women's rights during that time, the roles that women were expected to play, it has a big impact on the joy she suddenly feels of being a free woman and breaking out of that confined space, right? So the setting for this story is almost symbolic in a way, the location of it. But the time period is also very important to keep in mind. The atmosphere that's created in the story is a little more subtle. You have to really think about what's happening in each section of the story. So in the beginning, you know, she's in a public room. Remember, we talked about that beginning part is in the objective point of view. It's like there's no emotions. It's almost like it's dead. It's a spiritually dead atmosphere. It's very clinical. It's very, and there's no emotion. There's no feeling. And that's an interesting atmosphere to begin with. Then we have the middle, where she's in her bedroom, and as we talked about before, that is the section that is told in limited omniscient point of view. And when she's looking out the window, she sees those signs of spring and new life. And when, you know, springtime, birds chirping, trees and flowers, that it automatically sort of indicates a very hopeful and optimistic atmosphere because it's new life, it's new beginnings. So hope and optimism. That's the atmosphere that is created in the middle of the story, despite the fact that the setting is that very confined space within those four walls. It's almost as if the atmosphere that's happening outside the window is seeping into that confined space and changing how she feels, or mirroring how she feels. And then in the end, once again, she's back in a public room downstairs. And again, we're back to the objective point of view, which, you know, objective point of view does not give us access to any kind of emotions or thoughts. So again, we end with that very clinical, almost spiritually dead atmosphere. So the effect of all of that is that the story opens and ends with a mood that is very emotionless there's like this sense of deadness. It is brightened for 1 hour, and 1 hour only, when she is experiencing what turns out to be an illusion of freedom and joy. It was an impossible dream for a woman in that time and place. So the setting is super important. The atmosphere, also indicative of what we're supposed to gain from the story and what we're supposed to feel when we read it. But the atmosphere is a little more subtle. If you didn't really pick up on any of that, don't feel bad. You really have to think about what it means to have an objective point of view, and then what happens because it switches. Okay, so the point of view actually helps lead to the atmosphere as well, in addition to the setting where the story is taking place. So we then have Hills Like White Elephants, right? So the setting for Hills Like White Elephants, the location, is so important. We don't get very much information about the setting, since most of the story is the dialogue back and forth, but we do know that there are moments along the way where we do get a little bit of description in terms of what surrounds them. The first thing that we learn is about the setting on this side of the Ebro, right? And on this side, the hills are long and white. There's no shade. There's no trees. The land is very brown and dry. The setting on this side is lifeless and barren, just as Jig would be if she has the abortion. On the other side, there are fields of grain, there are trees and rivers and mountains. The other side is full of life, just as she is now pregnant, and the life that she would have, the life that she would birth, right? So, very opposing settings, right? And she's right in the middle. Also right in the middle is the train station. There's only 2 tracks, right? So that means you only have 2 choices. We also know that the train is coming soon. So if you're in that train station, if you're in that position, you only have 2 choices you can make, and a decision needs to be made soon. Interesting, because that is exactly where she is in her life. She is faced with a choice, and there's only 2 options. Have the baby, terminate. Those are her 2 options that we know of, that they've considered. And the 2 choices are represented by the opposing setting on each side of the station. One side, barren and lifeless. The other, very much full of life. Which one will she choose? So the setting, because obviously the dialogue does not really tell us what is happening between Jig and the American. It doesn't ever make it clear what they're arguing about, because they don't even really get into a full-on argument about it. But it's clear that it's a debate. It's clear there's a discussion going on. It's something that is important to both of them. They both have very strong feelings about it, yet we don't know exactly what the feelings are. We just know that it's strong and that there's tension, and the only way that we can start to figure it out is if we pay attention to the setting. So in this case, the setting for Hills Like White Elephants is a game changer if you can think about how opposite the descriptions are and how pointed the train station location is. So if you pay attention to the setting, you get some answers. Now, the atmosphere for Hills Like White Elephants, it is set in an unfamiliar place, both for us and possibly the characters. So anytime you're in an unfamiliar place, there's a certain level of nervousness, anxiety maybe. We also know it's very hot outside, which is always an uncomfortable feeling. They immediately begin drinking. And then they keep drinking more, and like more often. So, most of the time, and we wouldn't know this or assume this immediately as soon as they order their first drinks. They're just thirsty. They just are relaxing. They're on vacation, right? Many of us do that. It's as the conversation then progresses and they keep ordering and she wants to order more before they've even finished. Then you start to realize, and then she even makes the comment about how, all they do is, go places and, drink and try new things or whatever. And then you start to realize that the drinking is actually a sign of the tension and discomfort. We all know that, alcohol can be a buffer for difficult conversations. So that's another thing that adds to the atmosphere of tension. The short, terse dialogue definitely creates an atmosphere of tension. The longest sentence on the first page is only 5 words. That's the longest sentence on the first page, 5 words. And it's when the American snaps at her and says, just because you say I wouldn't doesn't prove anything. When she says that about the hills looking like white elephants. So again, the fact that it's very short and they're just very short with each other adds to the tension. And then when we finally get a longer sentence, he's snapping at her like they're fighting, but not really. She even begs him to stop talking. So clearly, everything about the dialogue, their actions, and how hot it is outside, very uncomfortable, intense atmosphere. And we feel it. We feel it big time. And if you didn't, then maybe you read through it too quickly. But if you're really trying to figure out what's going on and you're listening to this conversation, and especially since we don't get anything except the dialogue, it's like you're eavesdropping, which is also kind of a tense feeling. Especially if you're not sure if you should be eavesdropping, or maybe you have no choice, like if it's the couple sitting next to you at a table in a restaurant and you're still, trying to eat your meal and they're fighting or talking about something that should probably be kept private, and you're just sitting there like, okay, I don't really want to be hearing this. We're still continuing to read the story, but at the same time, you were assigned the story. You had to keep reading it. But there could have been a moment in there where you're like, I don't really think I'm supposed to be hearing this. And it's all adding up to a very uncomfortable, tense atmosphere, which is exactly what their relationship is at this point. Very uncomfortable and tense. So Hemingway uses all of this very purposefully and methodically to make us feel that way. Because if these two characters aren't gonna come out and really say what's on their mind, if they're not really gonna talk about this subject matter, then Hemingway's going to give us as many clues as he can. And creating that atmosphere is definitely one of them. So, thinking about setting an atmosphere again, for both stories, why is the setting significant to the story? Location and time. What atmosphere is created by the setting? And what does that atmosphere reveal? I think that setting and atmosphere are important in the story of an hour. They definitely help deepen our understanding of what Mrs. Mallard is experiencing, what she's feeling, why the ending occurs the way it does. It also gives us a deeper understanding of what Chopin wanted us to get from the story, what her message was, what her theme was. But I think that the setting and the atmosphere in Hills Like White Elephants is crucial. It doesn't just deepen our understanding, it helps form our understanding of the story. So I think both are important, but Hills Like White Elephants, man, setting's crucial. So if you have any questions about setting an atmosphere in general or within either of these stories, please let me know. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on to the next chapter.